Lord Vulcanheim examined her for several moments before guessing at what she wanted. Does it have to do with migrants? It's common knowledge amongst the nobility that you've been trying hard to attract more people to your territory. I doubt that you'd be willing to part with your townsfolk, Ludmilla replied. I take it that's something you've heard from the others already, he said. Still, I have plenty of farmers and woodsmen that I need to relocate somehow, and your territory is an attractive outlet. You'll have plenty of migrants to fill your town with, it would help us both. The administration of the Sorcerer's Kingdom disclosed nothing about class levels, bloodlines or aptitudes in the materials that it distributed, so Lord Vulcanheim probably did not understand that he stood to take the lion's share of the benefit in such an arrangement. Bringing people whose entire lives had revolved around farming or forestry into a city did neither Ludmilla nor the migrants any favors. In the past, one could move to the city and find a job as a menial laborer, but undead labor filled those positions in Ludmilla's territory. She could probably find a place for unskilled labor, say, apprenticing farmers to blacksmiths, but she would have to provide for them until they could complete their apprenticeships. This, in turn, was a gamble as a person's aptitude in an unfamiliar trade was unknown, as was their class build. The primary concern for migrants changing professions was how much they could advance their new profession before slowing down. If the aforementioned migrant had 7 levels as a farmer, and the average person slowed down before reaching platinum that was, level 15, Ludmilla could only reasonably expect a level 8 blacksmith. Though her grasp on classes and levels was only cursory at the time, the way Ludmilla had designed her farming villages pre-sorted her population. There was a specific ratio of professions in every village, which more closely reflected the ratios of urban populations. Every child was given a basic education and attempts were made at identifying their aptitudes before figuring out where they would find the greatest success. The fact that the Temple of the Six, with its extensive records on the bloodlines of its congregation, was the primary source of her migrants made the process immeasurably smoother. She had modeled many of the systems in her domain after the institutions of her faith and by integrating the wisdom of their sacred scriptures. The gods' wisdom was made clearer with every passing month as their teachings were made manifest in reality. Ludmilla would never be able to understand why so many would fall to heresy when the truths of the 6 great gods could be seen so clearly. That's also something I've heard from the others already, my lord, Ludmilla said. Unfortunately, I have no need for any more farmers or woodsmen. Forgive me for saying so, Miss Camilla, Lord Vulcanheim said, but that sounds insane. Your land stretches from the wilderness to the borders of my territory, so I can't imagine why you would refuse. Are you saying that you've already secured tens of thousands of migrants to occupy the areas you've expanded to? Not at all, Ludmilla replied. The reason is that I do not intend to develop the lands under my management much further than what I have planned already. A look of confusion fell over Lord Vulcanheim's face. He looked over at his similarly confused wife. But why? Lady Adelia asked. The entire House of Lords is green with envy over how much undeveloped territory you've brought under your title. Unless, does Lady Bloodfallen or His Majesty intend to create new titles for those lands? It was something that could potentially happen in Riestais if there was territory for the taking. In exchange for their liege's support, a frontier lord could agree to relinquish some of the lands that they claimed. It was an arrangement that benefited both, provided the investment was worth the risk. There is no such arrangement, my lady, Ludmilla shook her head. Then there will be an uproar in the House of Lords, Lady Adelia frowned. The central administration will be infuriated as well. They always go on and on about efficiency and taxes and production. If they see all of that idle land that you're doing nothing with. I am doing something with it, Ludmilla told her. What I'm doing is leaving it mostly alone. Then it will completely turn back into a wilderness. A tinge of frustration entered Lord Vulcanheim's voice. My house has been on the border of that encroaching wildland since before my father's time. I can't even imagine how many demi-humans will. His mouth worked silently as realization dawned upon him. That's right, Ludmilla said. The Sorcerer's Kingdom is no longer a human nation. It was members of the royal court that suggested that I do this, so the protests of the House of Lords will fall upon deaf ears. Sooner or later, non-humans will take their place in the House of Lords, and those protests will meet internal resistance. The echo of her voice faded away, and silence fell over the hall. Ludmilla's gaze went from Lord Vulcanheim to Lady Vulcanheim, who appeared to have nothing more to say. As leaders of humanity, Ludmilla told them, please work hard to ensure that there will always be a place for your people. Though admittedly forceful in her tone, she did her best to convey her genuine feelings. The people of Vulcanheim County were not followers of the Six, but the faith of the Six's divine mandate included all of humanity. They kept watch even over those who had lost their way, and the door was always open for them to return. Now, Ludmilla said, on to what I wanted to ask you about. That wasn't it? Of course not. I am here on the king's business. Bringing forward my personal concerns while I am here by His Majesty's authority would be improper. Well, that's laudable, I suppose. I suppose. Like common culture, noble culture also had norms that, while considered harmless by those who practiced them, in reality facilitated corruption. Every point of contact was an opportunity to make connections, increase awareness of various issues and impress or influence others. It was something that went hand in hand with the dance of protocol and discourse that occurred between members of the aristocracy. Very little, if any, thought was given towards how one was taking advantage of their position. An official appointment like the one Ludmilla held, as temporary and specific as it was coveted for this very reason. A noble with her appointment could travel and make new acquaintances while carrying the prestige and authority of a greater power. The unscrupulous would combine this with their personal interests, effectively presenting a veiled threat against those who might resist their proposals. If one still held firm, unfavorable reports and false charges would go straight to those in authority. To people like Ludmilla, duty was an honor. She did not kneel upon receiving the king's order simply in deference to the king's authority. It was in appreciation of the king's appreciation that she had been recognized as one who was capable of carrying out His Majesty's will and was worthy of trust in the duties that she prided herself in upholding. Even with her deep respect for the appointment and commitment to duty, Ludmilla had been invariably tempted into small talk that had nothing to do with the reason why she was here. It has to do with the utilization of His Majesty's undead servitors. The undead? Lord Vulcanheim frowned. Yes, they appear quite scarce. I understand the problems that come with adopting undead labor, but I heard that the majority of your Death Knights have been deployed along the borders. Is there a problem with that? Your territory is surrounded by other territories of the Sorceress Kingdom. Yes, but most of those borders are not with human lands. Are you saying that you've deployed your security forces to guard against other citizens because they're not human? Weren't you bemoaning the thought of looking like some evil magistrate just now? Lord Vulcanheim fell silent, fidgeting with a silver fork as he glanced down at his half-empty plate. That's a very strange thing to say for a follower of the Six, if you don't mind my saying so. It isn't just the Temple of the Four that needed to adapt to the realities of a secular nation, Ludmilla replied. It also doesn't change the fact that you've deployed Death Knights to defend against our nation's citizens. The administration understands that these things take time, he said after several moments. Our people need time to get used to things. You saw that parade of people that I had to sort out this morning. Even the idea that they had committed a crime led them straight to thoughts of being turned into monsters. Ludmilla set her utensils down before they warped in her grip. The Count had what he considered a strong argument. Even after months of being left in peace and seeing their lands prosper, the majority of the citizens outside of Corlin County and Wardensvale harbored reservations over the undead. Criminal activity was suppressed simply by the idea that those caught would have their souls enslaved for eternity by the Sorcerer King or one of his minions. Views on demi-humans that were historically a threat to humans were probably not much better. I don't disagree, my lord, Ludmilla said. The Prime Minister has an excellent mind for broadly gauging these matters. You should, however, understand the weaknesses in her approach. Well, it wouldn't be right to call them weaknesses, they are aspects of governance that are best dealt with by nobles and their retainers, and she most likely understands this as well. If things were as simple as adhering to almanacs, manuals and advisories, Samji would be sitting where you are right now. It's not as simple as sticking Death Knights on the roads. Lady Adelia suddenly spoke up again. She shrunk back slightly as their heads all swiveled towards her. It's not as simple as that, she said. We have to think about the people. That's right, Lord Vulcanheim nodded. If we just put them everywhere, there will be panic or paralysis or both. It's taken so much to get everything working again. We can't risk it. The city had to go through the same thing, Ludmilla noted, and the city didn't have the benefit of your guidance. Your leadership counts for more than you might think. If the supplies for Riesti's royal army had not been seized, Lord Volkenheim told her, the city would have starved. We don't have that sort of leeway here, and we cannot afford to do anything of the sort until winter. Once the autumn harvest season is over, we can start putting undead patrols on the rural roads without the risk of disrupting agriculture. It seemed like a flimsy excuse. Though rural areas contained about 95% of the duchy's population, they were still sparsely populated. The number of people exposed to undead patrols at any given point would be in the single digits unless a death knight stomped straight through the center of a village early in the morning. Lord Volkenheim also appeared entirely unaware of the notion that he was subtly fortifying his subjects. The ability was something Ludmilla couldn't feel herself applying to others, so it was understandable that he wouldn't notice it. Perhaps he had not harnessed it at all, or its effects were something that nobles and their loyal subjects always took for granted as normal. What about the town and the highway? That's even more problematic, Lord Volkenheim replied. Merchants from Riesti's will turn around and flee the moment they encounter a Death Knight patrol on the highway. The best we can do is keep a few in the town. You've stuffed them in your gatehouses, Ludmilla frowned. It's the best we can do, he repeated himself. My dear Adelia is right, it's not so simple. The delegation from the temple drifted to the forefront of her mind. The temples. The temples know the law as well as we do, Lord Volkenheim told her. Better, when it comes to the parts that apply to them. But you're not too far off with your thinking. In the same way that the temples cannot interfere with the administration of the realm cannot interfere with matters of faith. They legally cannot dictate which gods to follow. The sound of a bell filled the hall, striking twice to mark the time. They had to wait to be heard again. I really have to do something about that bell, Lord Volkenheim frowned. At any rate, my people cannot be as cavalier about the undead as yours. Followers of the Four are taught to universally revile the undead from the moment they are old enough to understand words. There were nuances between sects within the faith of the Six when it came to views on the undead, but saying so would only serve to support his case. That both Lord Volkenheim and his retainer presented the same argument in different ways gave her the impression that their reservations were a shallow excuse to avoid efforts to integrate the undead in the county. Undead labor was being used where people were willing, but the various issues specific to the territory were impeding progress. As an outsider, it was not her place to tell Count Volkenheim what to do unless it concerned matters under her jurisdiction. He probably had a better grasp of how to manage his realm and its people, so she would only be getting in the way. I suppose this means that you're unwilling to deploy undead servitors to help with this string of arsons. Not if it means disturbing my subjects, Lord Volkenheim told her. Andre says that we don't have nearly enough to cover every possible target. Anyway, what did you have in mind? I wanted to cast a net after the next incident, Ludmilla said. To detect any suspicious movement from the reported location. After the next incident? Lord Volkenheim sighed. How many more mills can I expect to lose? At least 2. And just how did you come up with that? Our criminal has picked up the pace of their attacks, Ludmilla explained. It has been over 2 days since the last incident, so there's probably a mill on fire somewhere right now. It just takes time for word to arrive since it's being delivered by local messengers. The Count's look indicated that he understood, but he certainly didn't like it. After this report, he asked, what will your plan be? Since the rate of attacks has increased, there should only be a limited distance that they can travel before needing to set up for the next one. Their goals appear to be both the destruction of property and the disruption of economic activities, so they are targeting facilities actively being used. They are not attacking any territories under your direct jurisdiction, and they are not attacking any villages or the town. Unless the attacker deviates from this pattern, we can expect them to be attacking your untouched lumber mills. So the next incident will tell you how far he can go, Lord Volkenheim murmured, and you'll have undead forces waiting for them to leave the next location after the attack. It's a boring plan, Ludmilla shrugged, but it should do the job. As dessert arrived, the door to the town hall opened a crack. Andre slipped inside. Young Master Lord Volkenheim, he said before he completely made his way to the dais, a messenger just arrived on horseback. Another lumber mill? Yes, my lord. In the southwest of Allard Barony. Miss Camilla, Lord Volkenheim shifted to address Ludmilla. Is there any way that you can carry out what you proposed without disturbing my subjects? There is, my lord. Then, go ahead. The sooner we end this, the better. The sheer difference in the amount of information we have access to now versus what it was like in Riestais never ceases to amaze me. How you managed to live in such ignorance for so long never ceases to amaze me. A self-deprecating smile appeared on Ludmilla's face. It certainly did feel that way, so she did not disagree with Nobe's remark. Meticulous surveys, aerial surveillance, divination magic, information management. In the past, even if one knew of their existence, it was just something they had to live without. Even a tiny fraction of what was available in the Sorceress Kingdom would be an exorbitant luxury in Riestais. The resources required simply did not exist or were too expensive to maintain to any significant degree. The place that you and Moman hail from, Ludmilla asked, is it like this there as well? It is immeasurably superior, Nobe answered immediately. It was a small wonder why Nobe perceived Irantal and its people the way she did. The duchy probably felt little more than a primitive backwater to her. That darkness had even chosen to act on the people's behalf, perhaps it was out of sheer pity. Leanne Wagner's assertions over how far behind their little corner of the world was held little meaning for Ludmilla at first. It wasn't until she was made to realize just how ignorant she was that true appreciation for her friend's sentiments started to set in. As time passed and slow progress was made, the situation that humanity was in only grew increasingly dire in her eyes. Having lived in Warden's Vale for her entire life, she had no real sense of how much more advanced their neighboring nations were. She had been to Fierberkana, but it wasn't the best of comparisons considering the Dwarf Kingdom's declining situation since the demon god's rampage. Still, the surviving examples of architecture and craftsmanship in their ancient capital pointed to a past with culture and artifice far beyond anything in Riestais. After traveling for most of the afternoon, Ludmilla and Nobe now stood in the shadows of a small forest a half-dozen kilometers east of the most recent arson. The location had an old creek bed that had long since dried up. Hidden in a bend of the gully that ran through the trees was a hollow at the base of a limestone outcropping. Looks like someone used to live here, all right. Out of the depths of the hollow, Andre appeared. He unbent himself after clearing the confined space. Any idea who it was? Ludmilla asked. Humans, probably, Andre answered. It doesn't have any of the common demi-human leavings, at any rate. Whether it was druids or bandits that lived here I couldn't tell. Whoever it was, they've been gone for years. How much room is there inside? It widens out into a nice big cavern about 40 meters in. Could fit a hamlet in there. Great, Ludmilla nodded. We'll set up in there. House Volkenheim won't take any issue with this location, I assume? I doubt any of the people will show up here, so it should be fine. Ludmilla turned her gaze up towards a gap in the canopy. You're clear to land. A dark speck appeared in the twilight sky. The speck was followed by more, growing larger as they descended. Robes fluttering in the wind, 24 elder liches floated down into trees. Andre glanced about as they settled to the ground around them, placing a nervous hand on the pommel of his sword. Ludmilla suddenly realized that, while he might be able to sense their presence, he couldn't see them. You can dispel your invisibility now, she said. As one, the elder liches removed their enchantments. Andre gave a startled shout. Sorry Andre, Ludmilla offered an apologetic smile, I should have said something before they came down. Are so many elder liches really necessary? Andre replied in unsteady tones, I know Lord Volkenheim gave you permission to bring in the undead, but you could wipe out 4 or 5 cities with this. The truth was that they had already been well on their way before she proposed her plan to Count Volkenheim. As Ludmilla was there by the king's order, there was no need to defer to the will of the local lord, even if they were higher ranked than her in normal circumstances. Despite technically not requiring his permission, it was good that she had his cooperation in the matter. They're not here to wipe anything out, Ludmilla told him. They're here to help with surveillance. I sure hope so. Looking at him curiously, Ludmilla wondered what the man was thinking. Just how Facet County had met its fate so quickly was a mystery to most. The summaries provided to the nobility stated that 90% of the population had been exiled, but Andre had shown little confidence in the central administration or the undead. Or her, for that matter, Maybe he thought she had used elder liches to raise Facet County. They moved into the cave at the rear of the hollow. As Andre had described, a good-sized cavern lay not far within. The flow of water echoed lightly over the stone. Apparently, the creek above had not dried up, it had simply moved underground at some point. Traces of the former occupants could be seen on one side of the cavern: rusted tools, old rags, rotted wooden boards and an old fire pit. What was left gave no real indication as to what the cave had been used for. Based on how she had located it, however, Ludmilla held her own suspicions about the place. The caterpillar maps that Nobe was so disparaging of were not only a result of poor quality or limited resources. How they had been made spoke of the territory's history. One could see how the people spread over the land and what each noble had prioritized in the past. There were also the accumulated efforts at enforcing law and order, where adventurers and militia rooted out bandit hideouts, discovered smuggler caches and fought to drive out demi-human tribes. On the other side of things, one could discern certain locations that were purposely left alone. Coercion, bribery and the desire to hide one's illicit activities led to the creation of safe havens for crime and corruption. By comparing the old maps to those created by Lady Aura, these locations became very apparent. The cave that they stood within was one such place. Shortly after her arrival in Valkyrie County, Ludmilla had gone and perused the county records, making comparisons with the up-to-date maps of the administration. Her initial thought was to look for places where holdouts of organized crime still existed. Then, she realized that their existence was unlikely. Any locations of that nature would have been cleaned out during the initial sweeps of the newly annexed duchy. With Lord Vulkenheim's request that they not disrupt the daily life of his domain with the presence of the undead, she took the opportunity to confirm whether her hunch about the maps had been correct. What was Croston like before Count Vulkenheim took over? Not so great, to be honest, Andre's voice echoed through the cavern as he looked around. Nowhere near as bad as Facet County, but there were still some major issues. The two Broniel families that fled after Katza were pretty terrible, while the rest weren't that far behind. Baroness Allard came afterwards, of course, and your group found her clean. So the rest of the Count's current vassals? They weren't groomed for rule, Andre told her. Sure, you can pick up on some of their familial attitudes, but they were all raised to be ladies, not lords. What's that supposed to mean? Nobe asked. Andre gave Ludmilla a tense, sidelong glance. His relief was visible when she supplied an explanation. Noble scions are raised with legal realities in mind, Ludmilla said. The expectations between boys and girls are different, as is the way they are taught to conduct themselves. The implications of law and its effect on cultural practices came naturally to Ludmilla, but Nobe appeared to be at a loss. Men inherit before women, Ludmilla explained. This is not only for noble titles but also in regards to charters, contracts of tenancy and any property a family might own. Families only invest as much as they can afford when it comes to grooming their heirs. The children most likely to inherit receive priority. The noble women of Erantal appear to be doing far better than the noblemen I've seen in Riestais, Nobe pointed out. They have, of course, received assistance from His Majesty, but Lady Albedo considers them better suited for their roles. If it is as you say, and families focus on equipping their male heirs, how can this be? It goes back to children being an investment, Ludmilla replied. While men are raised to rule, women are expected to marry into other families, fostering relations between houses, supporting their husbands and having children. This is what Andre meant by the fact that the noble women here were all raised to be ladies. Nobe kicked a stone and watched the brief disturbance as it plopped into the nearby creek. Going by her ignorance on the matter and the fact that she was a powerful adventurer, it probably wasn't something that sat well with her. Male sons so far down the line of inheritance that they did not receive any attention from their families, often sought a way out of their circumstances by finding employment in the household of a wealthier noble, becoming adventurers, merchants or trying their luck in cities. If they were fortunate, they might even receive a handout from their families who were only too happy to be rid of them. It was much harder for women of noble birth to escape the fate of being married off, should they desire their own freedom. Noble women were a valuable commodity that their families were loath to let go of. Even if they found work as maids in other households or priests in temples, arranged marriages would still find them as they were still ultimately answerable to their parents. I see, Nobe said. So you're all breeders. Andre went into a fit of coughing, and Ludmilla's mouth fell open. Family is important. In her undead state, she wondered how she could be so indignant. I don't see what that has to do with the noble women inheriting in Nerantal being better administrators. It's not that part in particular, Ludmilla replied. It's everything else. In Riestais, political courts are the arena of men. Men are also expected to make major decisions as the head of the family. They also have military obligations to their liege. With this being the case, noble women are expected to have the skills to keep a noble house in order while their husbands are away on business. If I had to put it in any one way, we're raised to be the stewards of the house that we marry into. The sort of political boldness and aggressive ambition that people attribute to noblemen is not very common in Riestais' noble women. Instead, we work from behind the scenes, supporting our families and doing our best to ensure smooth operations. This is not the case in Nerantal, Nobe pointed out. Noble women are in charge of all but 3 of the houses. The fact that we are does not change how we were raised, Ludmilla said. It's not that we're lacking in ambition or initiative, it's just that our approach to things is fundamentally different. This fundamental difference is most likely the reason why the Prime Minister considers us better suited. We were raised to be accommodating and flexible because that was what our future demanded of us. It just so happens that the transition to the new government and the introduction of so many new systems is best handled with our mindset. Nobe remained silent, seemingly uninterested in further discussion. Ludmilla found a dry, flat area of the cavern floor and pulled out her maps of the observation area. She called the elder liches together and started placing different colored markers over locations on the map. The last arson was in this village here, she pointed to a red marker. We are operating on several assumptions. The first is that our target is attacking active production bottlenecks in an effort to disrupt this territory's flow of resources. Population centers have been untouched so far, so that leaves the lumber mills. The black markers are the locations that have already been attacked. Our second assumption is that our target does not intend on attacking locations outside of Volkenheim County. They are also not attacking any of the territories under Count Volkenheim's direct control. After her summary, Ludmilla went on to divide the elder liches into 6 groups of 4. Each had 1 elder lich assigned to coordinate with the other 3 in its group. The elder liches would summon 4 wraiths to be invisibly deployed over potential target areas. They couldn't station summons everywhere, but the wraiths would easily spot any smoke drifting into the sky. Their summoners would immediately be made aware and relay the information to the group commanders. Once this happened, their forces would converge to create a large cordon outside of the reported location. The elder liches would work to identify and question those leaving the area. Rural residents only occasionally traveled from their home villages, and the ones here were even less likely to with the recent wedding festivities in Croston. As long as their mysterious arsonist wasn't using some advanced technique to escape notice, they would be quite noticeable transiting the countryside. After spending time answering their questions and reviewing points she thought might have been misunderstood, she dispatched the elder lich teams to assume their vigil. Andre, who had quietly observed the briefing, walked up to Ludmilla as she watched the elder liches make their way out. That took longer than expected, he said. Why do you say that? We don't spend nearly as much time issuing orders to the elder liches sent here as administrators, Andre explained. It doesn't seem necessary, they do their work all the same. I'm sure you could have just told them what to do. Ludmilla turned to look over at Andre. What about Sanju? She asked, the 2 of you often speak at length. Sanju's been the main point of communication between House Volkenheim and the undead, Andre answered. We needed one of the elder liches to act as the go-between. You mean that Sanju's the only elder lich that you speak to? Pretty much. As I said, it's unnecessary. Ludmilla placed a hand on her hip, glowering down at the cavern floor. It is, she muttered. Beg your pardon? It's necessary, Ludmilla told Andre. The Death Knights I might be able to understand since they're ridiculously untalkative most of the time, but there should be no excuse with the elder liches. What? I don't really get it. It's not like they're interested in hearing about how my kid's just starting to learn how to walk. You don't need to talk about your personal life, Ludmilla said, but you should at least be working with them. Sanju and the other elder liches had to train in order to do their jobs properly. They may seem impressive when it comes to certain tasks, but they've only learned the basic skills to function as administrators. From what I've observed, the people here treat elder liches and death knights as tools to be employed when the situation calls for them and stored away otherwise. This stance is wrong. They can think and learn. They have a desire to improve and excel in His Majesty's service. They should not be treated like tools, they are more like your apprentices. Admittedly, the language used by the central administration and the way that the undead servitors carried themselves did not help to convey this fact. They were too proud to bend or admit to any fault or weakness. The nobility made assumptions of their own and feared that anything they did might be considered resistance or even opposition to rule. Count Valkyrie, however, was lauded for his conscientiousness and regard towards even the least of his subjects. He was an individual who should have noticed and understood what was going on. Yet, he did not. He didn't even give them a chance. Ludmilla wasn't sure whether it was because she had expected better of Count Valkyrie or the fact that the undead were being subjected to a double standard, but it irked her to no end. Andrei looked over his shoulder to the coordinating officers still standing around the map. So all those elder liches are your apprentices? Whenever such a relationship can be applied, yes. The ones that just arrived are officers of the Royal Army. As a frontier noble, my duties include seeing to the defense of the realm. Ensuring that our forces are adequately prepared for any of the circumstances that they might find themselves in is a large part of that. I see, Andrei replied. The Death Knights here are not an official part of the Royal Army, however, they're more like a domestic security force. There's still much for them to learn and grow accustomed to, Ludmilla told him. As it stands in Valkyrie County, the undead are being denied opportunities to learn outside of wherever you've hidden them away. They have next to no interactions with the subjects. The people responsible for acclimating them to the unique characteristics of this territory are not doing anything of the sort. You and the other rangers in the service of the nobility here are in a position where you can teach them the ins and outs of the fief and how to effectively maintain its security, but you have left this task to the general orders of the elder liches. Is it not a bit shameful for a ranger to leave the defense of their territory to a bureaucratic functionary? I understand what you're getting at, Andrei said, but it's still something that will take time. It does take time, Ludmilla agreed, but this county has hardly taken any steps at all. You've only done the bare minimum of what is required of you. The undead are not going away anytime soon. The sooner you become accustomed to them, the better. You must be exhausted by now, Miss Camilla. Why not get some rest? Andrei's voice drew Ludmilla out from her thoughts. She looked over to where the ranger appeared to have made himself comfortable. He had gone out to gather deadwood from the forest outside, and now a small campfire cast flickering shadows around the cavern. Do you patrol or stand sentry often, Andrei? When I was younger, yeah, his voice turned nostalgic. I guess you're at that age where you feel like you have the energy to do anything. It's that sense of youthful invincibility that got me hired on as a retainer in the first place. Ludmilla walked over to where Andrei was seated, leaving Nobbe and the elder liches where they stood around the map on the cavern floor. She didn't get too close, however. It was common for undead to be weak against fire, and igniting like a dried-up pine tree was not something she wanted to experience. The abundance of magical lighting in Warden's Vale made open flames rare, so the notion hadn't crossed her mind until she came to Valkyrie County. She knelt over the stones, opposite from where Andrei was lounging with an elbow on his bedroll. So your family wasn't always in House Valkyrie's service? Ludmilla asked. Nah, Andrei waved off the notion. My family, we were something like drifters. I think my dad once mentioned that he came from one of the frontier territories that collapsed, but I can't even remember the name of it anymore. He migrated inland and settled down, just like most of the people from out there. As the border lords faltered, some of their subjects would migrate to Warden's Vale, but the rest were unaccounted for. In hindsight, she supposed it only made sense that they moved inland after experiencing the slow and painful failure of the borderlands. I was always curious whether you have some of the same ancestry as me, Ludmilla said. Andrei was a fairly common name amongst our subjects. Could be, Andrei nodded. I didn't grow up around my dad's people, so I've no idea of the language and culture. All I have is my name and my father's blood to speak for it. So your father was a ranger as well. Did he become an adventurer after he left the frontier? That was me. My dad was just a hunter. It was a pretty good living for him, since the southern territories were retaken by the wilderness. Hunting out there wasn't considered poaching. He'd go out for a week at a time, coming back to sell whatever he brought down. The man wasn't the ambitious sort, he was just happy that he could provide for his family with his hard-earned skills. I know the type, Ludmilla smiled warmly. You said you became an adventurer. Does that have anything to do with you ending up in House Valkyrine's service? Andre stretched out to pick up a branch from a nearby pile, adding it to the fire. That's right, Andre nodded. The previous count hired me on as a guide for his coming-of-age ceremony. He was so impressed with some of the tales I shared with him that he offered me a position as one of his retainers after we were done. What kind of tales? The kind that a sense of youthful invincibility leads to, I guess. He offered a self-deprecating smile. The one that really got his attention was more like a misadventure. I bit off more than I could chew and ended up fighting in the wilderness for days. Similar experiences were not uncommon, so Ludmilla could easily imagine what he meant. Sometimes people got separated from a patrol and showed up again much later, or one underestimated how bad of a situation they could get themselves in. Those that survived to tell their tale would spend more time hiding and eluding their opponents than killing them as they slowly worked their way back to safety. You told the old lord about that, I trust? After I got a little bit older and wiser and learned to swallow my pride, I did, Andre said, but it didn't matter to him. The fact was that I pulled off what no one in his employ could even come close to accomplishing. He did love talking me up in front of people, though, maybe watching me squirm over that old story was his way of getting some payback. What about your current liege? Oh, he still thinks I killed 1,000 monsters. I do have quite a number of assorted demi-humans, beasts and monsters under my belt, but the truth's nothing like facing down 1,000 monsters at once. What's the harm? I figure, with the way things are now, we'll never need to fight like that again. Ludmilla wasn't sure if that was entirely true. While it was certain that the civilian population of the Sorceress Kingdom would be protected from all but the most catastrophic of threats, citizens who sought service in the military would most likely work in environments where they would have to be able to deal with opponents that were at least equivalent to the embellished version of Andre's tale. That should be true for the most part, Ludmilla said. Anything that can get by the army is something most people won't be able to deal with anyway. You're pretty strong as far as house retainers go, though. Did you accompany the old lord to Katza? I didn't, Andre shook his head. The old lord figured it'd be a waste of my abilities being mixed in with the levy. The way we parted was damn ominous, too. Neither of us wanted to leave our families, but the lord had his obligations. He asked me to take care of his son in case he didn't come back. I see why you're so loyal to the count. It's a debt I can never repay, Andre swallowed. Not only do I owe my position and marriage to the old lord, but he kept me out of that bloodbath. Because of that, my son still has a father. It's the least I can do to take care of his. Andre sniffed, wiping his eyes with a sleeve. Ludmilla left him with his gratitude, returning to the circle of elder liches. There wasn't any pressing need to stand there, as the next arson wasn't expected for another day or two, but Ludmilla had little to do. Their abrupt departure from Warden's Vale had her leave any remaining paperwork at home. With her observations of Vulcanheim County still fresh in her mind, she thought it best to review how other nobles handled their territories. Management of population centers like Croston was of particular interest to her, as the harbour town in Warden's Vale was on the rise. Ludmilla had no experience administering larger, urban populations. Certain things, like infrastructure, could mostly be counted to work as designed. People, however, had wills and desires of their own. The cultural norms of Riestais, the faith of the Four, the ignorance and backwards thinking that came with being in a poorly developed and mostly insular nation. Illiteracy, poverty and superstition were a part of everyday life. She was once again forced to realize the advantages that came with starting from scratch, though she doubted that her old villages would have been an obstacle. Larger populations had a certain inertia to them, and influencing modes of thought and cultural norms was a monumental challenge. Figuring out the way forward was just as difficult. Ludmilla often felt that it was akin to the blind leading the blind. Miss Norbe. I have a question. The adventurer looked up from the map, fixing Ludmilla with her dark-eyed gaze. What is it? Darkness has been visiting different parts of the duchy on a regular basis. Ludmilla asked, how do the other territories compare to this one? There are the ones we need to go to, and the ones that we don't. Those that we visit are not much different from one another, but the worst is one of the ones by the city. That was unexpected. The lands of least concern tended to be those closest to centers of power. By Urantal? How bad is it? An acquaintance of mine always says that the lord there is ripe for a spanking. Ardoin or Hamil? I don't distinguish between one tick and the other. Ludmilla wondered which of the two it was. Both were still young, and she had no idea how their territories were being managed. In a situation where a noble who had inherited was too young to rule, it was usually a relative that managed things on their behalf. At worst it would be members of the household staff that were familiar with their territory's workings. Clara was neighbors with Lord Hamil, but she had not spoken of him in months. The two young lords weren't running things personally, were they? She had no idea what their personalities were like, as they were excused from participating in the House of Lords due to their age. As evening fell, she returned to join Andrei at his campfire. Her subjects were used to her always being out and about, but the people of Vulcanheim County still very much lived in the mundane reality of Riastais. Even without her tireless nature, they might have seen her patterns of activity as suspicious or at least uncharacteristic of one of their own. Andrei didn't give her a chance to gauge her caution, however, as he nodded off shortly after. He appeared to be of an age with Ludmilla's father, though if she recalled correctly his son was just starting to learn how to walk. Given that he had been the old Lord Vulcanheim's guide during his coming-of-age ceremony, it seemed that Andrei had married unusually late in life. Ludmilla was left to ponder how she would handle the passing of ages. The flow of time felt much the same to her as when she was still human, and her 17 years as a human was still a lifetime to her. Yet, she would now see the end of Andrei's lifetime, that of his son and all of his descendants, should their family line continue. Would they one day come to her and ask what she knew of Andrei the slayer of 1,000 monsters, or Andrei the fiercely loyal knight of House Vulcanheim? Would her people and their families come to her for the same thing? As generations and centuries passed, would Ludmilla still be able to remember the events of the distant past, or would it fade like human memory did as time wore on? Elishnish and the role that Lady Shiltir intended for her became ever more important in Ludmilla's estimation. With the flawless memory of a frost dragon, she and her fellows would indeed become living keepers of the past. Perhaps one day Ludmilla would need to rely on her to awaken memories of eons otherwise long forgotten. She brooded in silence as the night passed, and the morning offered little in terms of excitement. The elder liches stood around the maps and Nobbe kept to herself even as she kept an eye on Ludmilla. Andrei couldn't stand the boredom and moved in and out of the cave dozens of times as he tried to find ways to pass the time. After a while, Ludmilla came out to join him. "As old as I am," Andrei's voice greeted her, "it seems you possess far more patience." The ranger was seated on a rock nearby, basking in a patch of sunlight. "I have a lot to think about these days," Ludmilla replied. "Many things have changed, and I can see no end to it." "That sounds pretty double-edged." "I don't disagree," she said. "That's why I have to constantly stay on top of things, as well as keep an eye on future horizons. Good thing I'm not in a position where I have to worry too much about that." Andrei stretched as he rose from his seat. "I'm sure Lord Vulcanheim won't lead us astray. He's a good man. All I have to do is serve him well, and he'll take care of me and my family." Voices from the past echoed in her mind. She had heard it so many times when people spoke of their relationship as subjects to her father. And they tried, they really did. Both her father and the villagers of Warden's Vale. They were simple, honest and hard-working people who kept faith in the gods and with each other. Reciprocity, charity and respect for the dignity of life. Good people led by a good man. Good, it may have been, but it wasn't enough. Like any sanctuary, strength was required to defend it against those who brought strength to bear. Not just physical strength, but economic might and strength of spirit and character. Without the cornerstones that made the foundations of civil society, anything built up could all too easily come crashing down. The cornerstone of physical might in the sorceress kingdom was a monopoly held by the sorcerer king. Count Vulcanheim might be able to achieve everything else, but the sanctuary that he offered to his subjects would always be at the mercy of his liege. "A good lord needs good vassals," Ludmilla said. "Not just men and women whose only defining quality is being good, but those who can truly serve in the capacity that their lord requires. In the same way, a good lord cannot rule solely out of good intentions, he must be the leader that his people need." "That's some pretty heavy stuff coming out of someone that's around the same age as the Count," Andrei raised an eyebrow. I don't think I'm here simply by His Majesty's whim, Andre. I do not mean to say that County Valkenheim must undergo a change in character, but the most effective way in which he can serve his people is by proving to the royal court that what he offers is of value to them. It is technically no different from how a noble of Riestais should behave in their service to the crown, but His Majesty has no balance of power that he must step lightly around. I think my lord understands this, deep down, Andre said. I'll let him know what you said nonetheless. Anyway, you probably came out here to clear your head, so I'll stop making you think too much about work. Ludmilla reached into her infinite haversack, withdrawing her longbow. Andre leaned to the side with a befuddled expression, as if looking for where the 2-meter-long bowstave had been stashed away. Practice? He asked as she strung the weapon. I find it relaxing, Ludmilla replied. I was also hoping to learn a trick or two from an experienced ranger.